Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about the Beatles' 1965 offering Help. That rather carefree, sunny, jangly album with some acoustic guitar work in it. Um, Quite possibly, as well, a revealing moment in the band's career at that point, notably John Lennon. Because underneath the jokes, of course, and the movie itself, Help, um, and the acoustic guitars and romance songs. This album is basically John Lennon waving a tiny emotional flag and saying, "Do you know what, guys? I'm not really okay. So let's go and talk about Help, the album." Before we get into the songs, we need to understand where the Beatles were when this album came out. Now, it's 1965. Beatlemania is still mental and rampant. And the poor guys can't go outside. They can't even hear themselves play live. They're filming movies, recording albums, and they're touring non-stop and being treated like products instead of people, and completely and utterly worn out to boot. But somehow, these guys are still expected to crack a smile, jokes, write perfect pop songs on command. So Help, yeah, technically a movie soundtrack, but actually, creatively, it's a bit more than that. Because this is where the Beatles start now to pull away from the pure pop formulas. Bit of a tongue twister there. They were writing more personal lyrics and they were experimenting with new sounds. It's not Rubber Soul just yet, but you can certainly see it coming. All right, then, let's start with the title track, Help. It is quite an upbeat sounding song, even though it's written about being overwhelmed. John Lennon later said about this song it was literally him asking for help. And he also classed it as one of the best songs he'd written in his career. When I was younger, so much younger than today. Sounds so weary, doesn't it? For a guy really still in his, 20s. The opening line basically already tells you this isn't a typical love song, and it wasn't intended to be, because he's talking about losing confidence, feeling trapped by fame, um, and also missing his old self. But it's wrapped up in jangly guitars, tight harmonies, um, and of course, it's quite radio friendly. But it's also the Beatles realizing that pop music doesn't have to be about just your usual love songs that don't have to tackle, songs that may feel to them at the moment shallow, but they can also write songs that can be honest but also catchy. Um, Now, one of the biggest shifts on Help, of course, is the use of acoustic guitars, because there's quite a lot of it. And this album, actually, if you compare it to the earlier ones, feels more relaxed, I think. Certainly more conversational in its tone, and it's less of a, I don't know, teeny bop pleaser, could you say, or less of a please scream now type of album. Um, they were growing up, because you've got such songs as You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, I've Just Seen a Face, and It's Only Love. Excellent, excellent song. And You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, it does stand out. It's influenced quite clearly by Bob Dylan, but it's also very, very much a product of John Lennon. You've got themes of isolation, insecurity, and being emotionally guarded. And really, it's not the sound of a band or a person enjoying fame. Really, it's the sound of a band starting to feel probably boxed in by it. Three. So while John seems to be spiraling a little bit on this album, Paul's songs on Help do seem to be full of motion and optimism and romantic energy. I've Just Seen a Face is a perfect example of this. It's fast and it's joyful and feels like falling in love mid sentence. Then, of course, Yesterday, you know, arguably the most covered song in history. And it's just Paul, of course, an acoustic guitar and a string quartet. No drums, no harmony, um, no band. So that alone really was revolutionary in itself. So the Beatles were, at this time, quietly proving that they didn't need to sound like a rock band to be the biggest band in the world. And you could imagine with all of that touring, all of that travelling, these guys will have honed their craft just so well, a bit like when they were performing in Hamburg before they hit the big time. Excellent stuff. So they're maturing. And then, of course, we mustn't forget this was important too for George Harrison. You know, his songwriting is improving. You can hear him gaining confidence. I Need You is it's simple, but it's also emotionally direct. A good song, I've got to say, to be honest. And there's also, of course, You Like Me Too Much. You might argue it's not a fan favourite, but it does show George, trying to carve out space for himself here. Personally, I've quite enjoyed the songs that George brought to the table. I quite like You Like Me Too Much, to be honest. I think it's a great song. But then I also like Don't Bother Me, a song he doesn't like, which is on with the Beatles. So there you go, I suppose. But, all of this matters because George's frustration of being overshadowed um, doesn't come out of nowhere later. It starts here. And that must have been supremely difficult to deal with, I would think. And then we've got Ringo, of course. Let's not forget him. He has a song called Act Naturally, which is a country cover. You could argue it fits him perfectly. Isn't one of my favourites. His role on Help isn't sort of about innovation. But, let's face it, this guy keeps the band grounded. He's got a great technique in his drumming. It's steady, tasteful. It isn't flashy, but you know what? I still think he's massively underrated. He is really the glue for the band. Without Ringo, you haven't got that. To be honest, without Ringo, you wouldn't have had some of the amazing songs, really, that you did. I think his work on lots of Beatle tracks is pretty outstanding and works so well. He's a real natural fit for these guys. So, production wise, Help, it sounds clean and professional. Let's face it, they had a great producer in George Martin there. The difference being, of course, with these songs is the feeling that these songs are more personal. They're less polished emotionally, slightly restless. But the Beatles really are trying to, push against the formulaic songwriting, the touring expectations, which were utterly relentless. And of course, being the teen idols that they had been, being cute all the time. It just wasn't them really anymore. Now, John did say that at this time of recording Help and, of course, making the movie, he gained quite a lot of weight. They were doing quite a bit of smoking quite a bit of marijuana at the time, I think, in 65. And, John said that he felt it was his, quote, Fat Elvis period. So, whether the overeating and the smoking of dope was just munches or whether it was just a way to cope with everything, which, as I say, was utterly relentless for them, who knows? But anyway, I think it sort of, wasn't a very sort of great time, I'm sure, for him. And it must have been insane being there at that time. So anyway, Help in itself, the music is quite upbeat. The lyrics, maybe not so much. You've got a sense of exhaustion in this album, uncertainty and wanting escape. But that tension really gives the album, I think, depth. It's the last Beatles album in a way that you could, maybe I'm being over dramatic, but I wonder whether this is the last Beatles album where you could almost believe everything is still fine, and things change fast because, of course, everything wasn't fine. But why does Help still matter today? It is, of course, a bridge. I've said before, Rubber Soul seems to be the bridge for Revolver and Sergeant Pepper's. And of course, the White Album, etc. But this album, Help, is the bridge because it connects the early pop Beatles, the teen idols that they were at the time, to the experimental, introspective Beatles. It shows them realising, how would I put it? It shows them realising we don't have to be what everyone else expects us to be. And I'm glad that is what the conclusion seemed to come to because, that decision sort of made the next few albums incredibly revolutionary and groundbreaking. Because, of course, without Help, there's no Rubber Soul, there's no Revolver, no Sergeant Pepper. This is really the moment when maybe the mask slipped somewhat. These guys really have experienced probably, their maturity has come through experiencing probably a double portion of life, really, in the space of the few years that they've been together. And of course, have been on the road. They've been together 24/7. These guys have lived 2 lifetimes in a way, you could argue. So they're obviously beginning to be a bit tired of the touring, and of course they've matured in the process, probably quicker than other bands have done up to that date, and probably afterwards as well, because they had it all. So Help, let's have a look. It may be not the best Beatles album, I don't know, I like it. It is is it their most human album? Possibly, with the, I don't know, maybe it's their most human, I don't know. But then again, you could argue that the White Album's their most human. It's the sound of these guys, the 4 of them being, exhausted and overwhelmed. They start to make changes to the music that they're producing. Maybe come across as if everything's still totally fine. But it's a good, timeless Beatles album. So, thank you all for watching this expose on Help. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If so, maybe consider subscribing and liking. Let me know in the comments where Help fits in your Beatles discography, and let me know what you'd like to see next, which Beatles album you'd like to see covered next. Until that time, of course, take care. Thank you for your support. Thank you for everybody who subscribes. I'll see you again soon, and take care of yourselves. Bye.